Greetings and welcome to another round of Master Phil in Your Corner. This podcast is episode number 108, entitled Training for Fighter Pilots. So we are pleased and honored to have a very special guest, Tony Acevedo, PhD. He's a scientist for the Air Force. I know, pretty cool. But before we get into our whole podcast on what he's done, how he's gotten this position, what he brings to our armed forces, we have to thank our sponsors. First, we need to thank philross.com, Kettlebells, bodyweight, self-defense, martial arts, virtual and in-person training. You can contact me virtually and see my training right online at Master Phil Ross on Patreon. I'm also on Burn Along. I have about over 150 videos there. You get access to me with over 2,000 other instructors. Book Survival Strong, actually the second edition will be out this fall. Going into the Christmas season, so you know what to put on your Christmas list for everyone. And then Ferocious Fitness and also the Kettlebell Workout Library. The Kettlebell Workout Library is available free if you have a Kindle membership. And seminars and certifications through the Bodybell Method, the minimalist approach to strength and fitness, ACE and NASM certified. We also have survival strong, defensive tactics, and body conditioning, as well as our knife fighting seminars. P3 training group, plan, prepare, protect, in-person online courses and workshops for civilians and law enforcement. And of course, Health is Wealth, virtual community outreach platform for mental and physical health, wellness, fitness, and education. We also have pay-per-view flicks, the Warrior Island show. Got to check it out. We'll be filming the Warrior Island TV series coming up on beginning of August. So look for further announcements. Fit Team, 100% natural protein supplements, vitamin soy health products, one sleeve BJJ, rash guards, shorts, shirts, hoodies, all sorts of other fight uniforms and apparel. Oh, also, when you go onto my YouTube channel now, you'll see me sporting all of the one sleeve apparel. The Winning Mindset, athlete, team, and corporate coaching, one-on-one presentations and workshops. And there we go. So, Tony, welcome to the Master Phil in the Corner podcast. Tell us your background, and to me, I don't know, I'm just like super impressed. I think it's super.
Thanks, Phil. Well, I appreciate it, man. I'm very humbled to be on this podcast with you. Really excited about it. So, in a nutshell, born, mostly raised in Brooklyn, New Jersey area. So I'm definitely a Jersey guy at heart. Went to the Coast Guard, 17 years old, did 4 years there. After that, I spent majority of my career in the fitness industry. Started off at Gold's Gym, what just about majority of us did. And first job, Pennsauken, New Jersey, Gold's Gym. Wow. There, and mixed it up with the old slabs of meat. So I got embedded into that whole philosophy and lifestyle, which I got out of the military, took me over to San Diego, where I started competitive bodybuilding because it was extremely prevalent there. But it's what I grew up knowing. So it made sense at the time. Did my first degree in undergrad in nutrition at a San Diego State. Then I got immersed in, fitness director for Gold's Gym. And then I got my first opportunity owning a gym. And then I kind of just transpired and just kind of grew at that space. And then this is a random one-off for my career. I ended up getting a hair at my butt. And there was this place called Jamba Juice. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Yes.
It's a West Coast smoothie thing, right? Yeah. So I went in there and I'm like, man, this is just trash, all sugar. So I ended up opening up a smoothie shop on the back gate of Camp Pendleton called Super Juice. I did really good there, sold it. It was kind of my one-off business idea. And then I ended up moving back to the East Coast. That's where my family and everybody's from, so it made sense. And then I opened up a place called Kicked Up Fitness and Performance, which was half boxing, kickboxing. So I was a boxer. I stand behind the boxing.
Where was that? Yeah. Where was that? Because it sounds familiar.
It was in Maryland, Annapolis, Maryland. So I had 3 locations there. It was awesome, man. I enjoyed every experience of it. Strength and conditioning side, whole background there. But kind of backing up beyond the business realm, probably 29 years old, I was realizing that, education was becoming more prevalent in the space. And I knew that I was going to need essentially to put, and I hate to say this, but it's the truth. But I needed to put acronyms behind my name because here in the United States, they don't trust you unless you're a doctor, you're a PhD. So I recognized that. So I started going back to school. I ended up getting my master's in nutrition. I got an MBA. Then I started off in getting a nutritional biochemistry PhD at UMBC. Realized it wasn't for me. I love biochemistry. I love bioenergetics. I love that whole space, but sitting behind a microscope just wasn't my flavor. I'm an in your face. I want to be in the mix. I want to be training people, that realm. So I dropped that and ended up doing a PhD in human performance, which was online.
In human performance, the PhD in human
And yeah,
performance?
human performance. Yep. Which online school, I love it because it made sense because, as business owners, man, we are extremely busy. You kind of having that luxury to go on campus is a luxury in itself.
Yes. Yes.
But online school is very difficult, especially at that level, trying to get research and find labs and. So long story short, COVID hit and you and I just had this conversation. It ruined me mentally, physically, and emotionally. It legitimately it took the life out of me. And it wasn't because of COVID in itself and all these implications. It was the government standpoint and what they believed in. But it was hard, and I don't want to go into the political aspect of it because I think it's nebulous in a lot of senses. But when I'm a science-based individual, and I have experience-based too, but when I'm trying to use science to make a really good decision for my members, and there's no science there, and I understand it was new and there's other things, but like the science stands behind fitness, it stands behind movement, it stands behind activity, it stands behind culturing and involvement, like that. You can't refute that. And all of a sudden, this whole immunology aspect where you're trying to refute like adaptability and all this other stuff. So it just wore me out. So long story short, COVID hit, rebuilt the gyms enough, sold them, and then I ended up taking a job. I was looking at two places. I said, I'm going to go to the academic space because I think it was time for me to kind of make that transition to where I now like my philosophy and my breading behind that. I said, well, I'm always a helper. Like I am an educator and a helper through and through. That's why you and I get in this kind of industry. And then I said, well, how do I help the most? Well, why don't I help a 17, 18 or 19-year-old going into this platform early on to where I can kind of conform them and help them make better life decisions moving through the system. So that's why I wanted to go to academics. I wanted to teach primarily undergrad. I did some grad teaching online, but it's cool. But I like the undergrad space. I feel like you can, in those who want it, but you can help change some different visions in that undergrad space.
You have a greater influence. Yeah,
100%.
Yeah, because as you know, I have my master's. I didn't go for my PhD, but I got my master's late in life, and mine was 100% online, which is yeah, it's got its challenges, but yeah, I wound up excelling at it, doing very well. It happened to work out very, very good for me because of my busy schedule and being I was a single dad too, time running my business. So I mean, there's no way I could have showed up on a campus. I have to be working at 10 to 1 at night, 1 in the morning on my projects and so forth. So I get it. But now are you teaching online now too, or in person?
Yeah, so I was teaching in person. I ended up getting a full-time faculty position over at Grand Canyon University. I taught there for 2 years. Phenomenal experience. I love it. I love embedding into the research, all that whole jazz. But ended up realizing, academics is great, but you're older than me. I don't want to mention your age, but here I am. No, because you look great for your age. So here I am.
I look like garbage for anything else. What are you trying to say?
No, you do, man. I'll tell you, you put you next to any other 60-year-old out there and you crush them. There's no doubt in my mind. But so I'm getting ready to turn 40 next month. And, academics is a very time-oriented kind of space.
Yes.
Meaning like you graduate early with your PhD. By the time you're 40, you're in a really good position. But getting into academics close to 40 is like you're starting over. So here I am showing up with 20 years experience and it just wasn't accounting for anything. So I was like, you know what? I need to make different moves. And I've always been doing research in the military space as prior service. I've always involved myself. I have a lot of love for my vets at all accounts. Yeah. So I got this opportunity to be the scientist for fighter pilots at a Luke Air Force Base, which is essentially one of the highest levels of fighter pilots for the Air Force. So beyond this, they go to their units and they fight wars. The only other higher level.
Let's back up because all of a sudden, boom, you had this opportunity. How did this opportunity come about? I mean, were you in a conversation with someone? Did you see something and you start
Oh,
talking to someone? What happened?
yeah, because like guys like you and I, we're gifts of gabs. I like to hear other people's
Yeah.
stories, to hear mine, and all this jazz. And I ended up meeting a gentleman who used to work over at Luke Air Force, and
Mhm.
he had a conversation one day. I was like, "Man, we're looking for a new scientist over there." They kind of upgraded the position. They were looking for a PhD to fill the role. It was kind of a graduate student prior to that, and
Yeah.
yeah, I said, you know what? I said, well, funny as you say. I said, I kind of think about getting out of academia, not in its entirety, but
Mhm.
full time. I said, this might be a good opportunity. So
Sure.
I went there, kind of filled it out, and negotiating, and finally landed it a few months later, and now it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So it's neat. So beyond that, that's kind of where I am in a nutshell. And currently I'm actually in my car where we're doing this podcast. I'm over in San Antonio, Texas, at the place called Southwest Research Institute, where they do pretty much all of the top end research for NASA and the Air Force. So
Wow.
anything aeronautical. It's this place. I wish it's huge. It's there's probably 20 something buildings. I actually have a giant map here of what this research institute, because
Yeah.
I couldn't find the building, so the lady at the front gave me a map.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so long story short, if we want to get into what I'm currently doing now,
That's
I,
yes.
I don't want to
Yes.
bore people with my background. I can
Yes.
show my
Oh.
dog pictures. Everybody loves dog pictures, but
Well, first of all, I think your background is incredible. I mean, like, you just keep pushing the envelope, always trying to get better, always trying to improve yourself, always looking for new ways to, reinvent yourself more or less, which I unfortunately had to do several times myself, so I get it. But this training for the fighter pilots, like, what's the focus here? I'm assuming there's a lot of muscular endurance involved. There's also probably a lot of neuromuscular training involved in it as well. So, I don't know if you, I don't want to give you away, I don't want you to give away trade secrets, but what type of training, what are the areas, what are the aspects that they need to improve on? And, how do you approach it?
yeah, no. So let me give the audience a little bit of context first. So for a fighter pilot, in my eyes, everybody's an athlete. There's a bazillion different sports, but this is a very, very particular athlete. So this athlete has to not only perform at its highest maximal capacity physically and cognitively, right? Like the cognitive output is just another level. So if you ever meet a pilot, you already know they're super smart.
Yeah.
But beyond that, they're fighting against gravity. So 9.81 meters per second is naturally, it pushes against us all day long, right? But now when they're flying, it magnifies that. So give you an example. So if you're 100 kgs, 100 kilograms, or 220 pounds, for every one aspect of gravity, you're just multiplying that weight. So if you're pulling 10 G's, like astronauts will when they're going out to space, if you're pulling 10 G's, you times your body weight by 10, and that's how much you currently weigh.
Wow.
So physiological, it is just astronomical output that you have to do. And so going into that alone, I'm like, oh man, like it needs a lot of science. And that's why there's been a lot of time. And there's different force vectors for gravity and all this jazz, but pilots, it's directly down on them, right? So if you ever get a chance, and if you look up like centrifuge training, or there's some videos out there now, and if you ever seen like these guys, like your whole facial distortion and all of your, it just starts to push down. It's like the ugliest bitter beer face you're ever going to get in your life. I haven't had the opportunity to be in one of those
What about
gravitation machines.
what about the rotator ride?
The Gravitron, remember that thing from the carnivals? That's what I actually use as an example. I said, remember the
Yeah.
Gravitron where you could get to turn
Yeah.
upside down and stuff like
Yep.
that?
Yep. Yep.
You could barely pull. So think of this. So that's a 2 to 3 G pull. Remember, you
Wow.
could barely pull your neck off the seat.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
think of this. They're pulling in the F-16s and F-35s and a lot of the 22s, all these different fighter jets that are made for combat, right? They're pulling up to 9 Gs. And a lot of the times they're pulling 9 Gs. So when they're combat and they're maneuvering, 9 times gravity. And now think of this. Now use this for physiological sense. And this is
Yeah.
why there's so much neck and back injuries. So if they're having this basic combat maneuver and somebody's behind them and they don't want to get shot out of the sky because that's what they're training for.
That's
And that's
not a
what
good
really happens.
thing.
No, no, not at all. So look, so 9Gs, they're maneuvering. Now they have to turn around and look. There's not rear view mirrors. You have to physically
No, you don't have a
look.
backup camera on a jet?
No. So like it is the most crazy thing that they have to go through. And now the things about it, so their helmets have all of these gauges and everything in it. So now you're putting another 5Gs on their head and they have night goggles here and it's pushing their head forward. So then they have to turn and the gravity's like it is a joke. There's some pilots that when they get into their first kind of set of training, where if they're maneuvering, debating on wherever their cyclic is, but if they're maneuvering and they happen to look down, they'll get stuck like this until they're done maneuvering. Like it will just hold you down. Like it's wild. So long story short, so besides myself, I'm the first contractor that's actually in place doing a lot of the research for the Air Force. There's a place called Air Force Research Lab, and out of the academy, they've been doing a lot of centrifuge research. So I'm actually like boots on the ground, looking at these aspects of pilots, trying to create how should we test these guys.
Yeah.
So they're going for this ridiculous amount of gravitational force, and the only way to combat that is, and what happens physiologically. And I'm trying to do this in a quick bed, so we're not here for 5 hours. But so when we start pulling G's, the blood goes from our brain and goes to our toes.
Right.
Can't avoid it. I don't care what orientation you are. You could be upside. It's the same. So if you see like some of these aerobatics guy, like oh, you ever see like the I don't know why I'm drawing a blank with the Navy guys who fly
With the Angels, Blue Angels?
Yeah, any of those guys, yeah. Like they are able to maneuver within inches from each other under these kind of gravitational forces. So what they have to do is they have certain G suits that they can wear that pushes pressure on their legs to try to push some of the blood back up. But that only helps for like 1 to 2 G's, right? So they actually have to physically contract their toes, their feet, their doors, like what any planner, I don't care what flexion you're doing, but you have to try to bring that blood back up.
So
And if you don't,
you're going to pass out, right?
you pass out.
That's right. That's you see, whenever you see things, the pilot passed out or whatever the case is. When you go into like a tailspin or something, people pass out. So it's kind of funny you bring that up because there's an exercise we do for Muay Thai fighting where you're contracting your lower body, contract. Because let's say you don't have time to warm up or stretch out. And I teach this when I'm talking to people. Hey, you're doing street corner self-defense, you're sitting there at the bus corner, and you think something's imminent. You may have to kick someone or run. Contract your legs, your butt, your abs, contract them and relax. Contract, relax. So it's kind of warming them up. But you're saying to hold that in that position and keep pushing the blood upward, push it out of the legs.
Yeah, and I mean, the amount of force, and this is where I'll get into with the testing and how we're starting to understand this. But the amount of force that needs to be reduced is astronomical, and they have to hold that. So not only you have to have this high maximal voluntary isometric control, which is MVIC is the acronym that we use for that, but you also need to have this high level of endurance.
Yes.
So what also goes along with that? Bioenergetics, right? You have to be physically fit anaerobically and aerobically. And aerobically is the amount of oxygen where cells are using oxygen. Anaerobically, think about us using glucose, right? Sugar. So they have to have all these different components in there. And then beyond that, they have to be cognitively aware of all these other things that are going on, not being shoot up the sky, making sure they're not going in a G-lock and because they could crash and die, which sadly enough, majority of the deaths from pilots were for a G-lock is gravitational loss of consciousness. They go into G-lock and then they crash. Well, the cool thing with technology, and right now we have 5th generation aircraft. These are the F-35s. By the way, it's not top secret, but war is imminent, just like anything else. The word on the street is probably going to be China. Not that I'm drawing out information, but that's kind of the conversation. So these F-35s are such next level. And my position is to make sure these fighter pilots are ready for us to go in a battle against China. That is the relevancy of my position right now. So I'm essentially assessing, understanding these pilots to make sure that when they get into that jet and they're going to fly, that they're the most badass they could ever possibly be. So that's essentially my job right now.
Yeah.
And I'm using every asset that I possibly can use in that
Yeah,
space.
I'm going to assume that you're doing isometrics, dynamic tension, using dynamic tension as well.
So
You're training. Are you using
yeah,
kettlebells? Are you using barbells, dumbbells,
so let's go
plyos?
into some of that stuff. So when I got to base, so mind you, Luke Air Force Base is I like it's like the mecca of Air Force pilots. So like I was saying, so when they go there, after that they're going to their unit. And the only other thing that they would do thereafter, if they needed to do that, would be like special warfare type training. They'll go to Nevada, and that's where they like hone in their missile skills. So they're not actually shooting here at Luke; they're flying. So a lot of it is their combat maneuvering. So anyway, so when I went there, there's a lot of anecdotal type testing, and it's not negligence to anybody. I say that in no negative aspect, but the problem is there's not really a lot of testing that has been done, especially here in the United States.
Yeah.
And some of the testing has been really tucked in under wraps for confidentiality. I don't want to share whatever it might be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to, and I have been over the last few months of looking at all these aspects. So we'll go to the isometric contraction. We were just talking about that. So I'm like, okay, well, they essentially have to grip and rip their legs at magnitudes, ideally somewhere between a duration of 5 seconds all the way up to 20 or 30 seconds. How do we test that? How do I understand if they could physically do that? Well, I could deadlift them, right? Of course, simple, but then I have to worry about injuries. Well, we know lower back and neck are super prevalent in pilots. So I'm like, well, I can't really load them because then I have to worry about injuries, but I do want to load them because I need them strong. So I'm like, right off the gate, I'm like, oh man, I'm battling like ethics, probabilities, and what should we be doing right now? What's science say? And then so of course, then we go to Vald made a system called isometric mid-thigh pull. So using force plates. Simple. It still creates tension, but I'm able to actually get an MVIC maximum, this voluntary isometric contraction. So I'm like, okay, cool. I'm getting this number now. I see how many kgs, how many newtons per kg they're able to pull.
Right.
So newtons is ideally what we measure things, and but we can convert newtons into kgs, but kg to kg is weird. So we do newtons and kg. So now I can see how much power they're producing. So, and it gives me an idea. Now, majority of the stuff I'm just drawing inferences on, right? So it's not going to be apples to apples. Like majority of the stuff is never apples to apples. Like when you train fighters, having them contract is not the same as them actually kicking somebody.
No.
But it will prepare them to do such.
Yes.
Right. So that's where I'm kind of I am at this point trying to create this normative value. How many newtons per kg do they have to produce in this isometric mid-thigh pull for me to say they could pull 9Gs consistently?
Right.
I don't have that number.
That's how do you get that correlation? The only way to collect some data and then test, right?
Time and testing, right? And that's my job. So that's the main aspect, right? And then ideally right now I have a good metric in mind, and this is I just pulled the data from Bald force plates, and they had this normative data. It's just general populations and athletes. So I'm like, okay, cool. Well, a fighter pilot should produce similar forces, debating on the sport, as ideally I like to use rugby players. Mm-hmm. Similar forces as rugby players because they're badass. Similar forces as rugby players, if not greater. Yeah. Right? Then that's the numbers where I'm kind of at right now. If you're sub part of that, I go to the strength and conditioning coach on base and say, hey, look, officer so-and-so, we should spend a little bit more time focusing on lower body strength output, right? And it's got to be transmissible, right? Because there's a ton of core strength that's needed for this whole, everything, right? Everything. Like you can't do anything in fighting without core strength.
No, when you showed me that move when they got pulled forward and pulled back, man, that's core strength. And I'm interested to see what you're doing for their necks. Because I'll tell you, I've taught tons of seminars. I've certified thousands of instructors on my time, right? I walk into a facility, here's people who are getting like 150, 200, $300 an hour, right? And I say, how many of you train your neck? And invariably, less than 10% of the people put their hand up. Isn't the neck part of the whole spinal column? Shouldn't be.
All right, Phil, let's save the neck we'll save the neck for last, because if we go to the neck now, we're going to eat up the rest of the time. So we'll save the neck for last. All right, so lower body wise, so going just back to that, I'm going to finish that off. So we're doing mid-thigh pulls. We're looking to see how strong they are able to produce force from the lower body up. This is kind of a good way for them to tactical. There's certain breathing maneuvers. It's kind of like a Valsalva maneuver that they use to help the blood get back up. So they'll practice that while we're doing the testing. And I'm working with metrics as far as durational stuff goes. And,
but people who don't know what that is, that's holding your breath while you're doing an exercise, the maneuver that.
So you're creating more abdominal pressure within the wall, which is what stabilizes your spine. It's the pressure. So like a weightlifting belt, the weightlifting belt is not there to stabilize the spine. The weightlifting belt is there for you to actually press your abdominal wall on that belt to create this, internal pressure. So that's what that's for. So now other aspects that we need to train, we do a inverted row. So we look at core strength, just basic muscle structure. We could have done push-ups, but an inverted row, we put their feet on a bench. So then they say we get this horizontal aspect. So that's kind of a good metric for us to use. And we just kind of use that as like a change. Like we want, like when we start training them to when we finish, we look at a change. And it's just overall strength, right? So then aerobically and anaerobically, we've been teetering, and this is kind of like one of my bigger challenge, minus to the neck, is we were doing a Wingate test. So anybody who's ever been to college or undergraduate and actually went to university and they're in exercise science had to do a Wingate test. It is a 30-second weighted test that is all out, and it should be all out, and it's brutal. And it's kind of a rite of passage for exercise science and all that jazz. And I make my students do it. And, the ultimate goal behind the scene with professors is we try to make them throw up because that's kind of fun for us, which you might do that when you're conditioning classes. I don't know.
But it's going to happen. I have the bucket there just in case.
And it's funny as hell and everybody enjoys it. I don't know. Other people's pain is sometimes our happiness. It is what it is. But so long story short, so we want to do that test, but it's hard to get the amount of output to actually capture the metrics. So essentially what we're doing anaerobically is I'm looking at just watts and power output. So I'm capturing those metrics and then I correlate them with. Now, aerobically is a harder metric to capture. You would think it would be easy, but the way the military is they work off of this so what factor, right? For me, physiologically and my science background, I said VO2 max. Why? It's the number one all cause for mortality. It tells me everything about your body. Without cardiorespiratory aspects, like nothing happens. So there's two factors that are the key factors for life: lower body strength and VO2 max, or VO2 in a total, right? So I'm trying to convince them, I'm writing review articles, and I'm trying to convince them that we should be playing a VO2 max in every one of these units, because to me, whether it's a VO2 max in itself, and VO2 max, for anybody who doesn't understand what it is, it's when you intake oxygen, that oxygen has to go to all of your tissues, your organs, and your peripherals. So we capture what that number looks like. And then when we're done using that oxygen through biological processes, we get rid of CO2. Simple process. And we measure that. So that in its entirety tells me who you are as a human being aerobically, and it's a predictor of life longevity too. Like if you have a VO2 max sub 18, life longevity is probably not going to be there. So long story short, so I've been working on that, trying to create a metric that makes sense. The idea of them spending money on metabolic carts throughout the Air Force is probably not going to happen. So I'm probably going to use some submaximal testing just to kind of capture that number and that metric. And along lines of like looking at other things too, like ventilatory threshold, the way they're breathing, how they use lactate, all this other jazz. I don't want to bore everybody with that stuff. So aerobically testing, to me, VO2 max makes sense. Anaerobically testing a Wingate power output wattage, that makes sense. So those are kind of like our bread and butter testing. And ideally, we've been using that to create workout programs. So the pilots initially, when they get to base, we get them for 8 weeks. So day one, they come in, we test them, we test all these metrics, we design a training program based if there's any limitations in the metrics, and then we deliver that for 8 weeks. Now, after that, they're there for another 4 to 6 months debating on how fast, and then they'll come in, hopefully at least twice a week, debating on their schedule, because everything is time. There's a lot of flying. There's a lot of learning for them to do. So time is always the issue. So essentially, we'll program design them, and we try to train them along their whole entire course. So now the big issue across the Air Force in itself and any warfighter pilot, like it is pretty continuous between the Finnish across in Europe and Australians. The neck. The neck is always a conversation. So so before I even go into the basic thought process of this, like, so let's start there, because when I walked into it, I said, well, I was a boxer. I boxed since I was 6 years old. I boxed professionally. I was always involved in it. What do we always do? I wrestled too. What do we always do? We were bridging, or we add a load, something to the neck. Why? Because there's science behind that. It shows it reduces the aspect for traumatic brain injuries and concussions.
100%.
But also, it is something that is one. It moves in every degrees of motion, and you need strength behind it, and it supports something called your brain and your cranium. Like, I couldn't wrap my head around this idea. Why aren't we training the neck at a high capacity?
It never made sense to me. Never made sense to me. Yeah.
So I went in there with that kind of philosophy, and I kind of not pissed people off, but I moved some things around when I realized they weren't strength training the neck. Well, like, oh, we don't want to create too much tension. I'm like, I understand that. I get that aspect. I was like, but if we're not creating a strong neck, the probability for all these other injuries, and I can go into all the science because I've read just about every paper so far on the neck. A strong neck reduces the incidence of how much your muscles have to activate, which then reduces the probability of pain and all these other,
and fatigue.
and fatigue and all these other etiologies that come along with that. So I'm like, I just couldn't wrap my head around that. So first thing I did was I was like, okay, well, who pulls a very similar amount of G's as a fighter pilot? I'm like, well, F1 racing. What's F1 racing doing? One, and by the way, they're the 5th largest sport in the world, one being soccer. So I'm like, well, shit, they have all their own sciences, and they spend a ton of money. I'm like, what are they doing? Start looking them up. Luckily, I skydived with a couple Red Bull guys. They linked me up with the right people to speak to, and I found out, like, they trained the bejesus out of their neck. No shit. Makes perfect sense, right? So now I'm pushing that narrative, and ideally what I'm trying to do is so the Air Force does a lot of cervical endurance holds because that's very prevalent. The Air Force is PT heavy, physical therapist heavy. So, and I understand, like, walking in, understand that, like, physical therapists are there to reduce injury, mitigate risk, support that, love that. But when the idea of thinking about training, like, if you go to the physical therapist and
you're not going to get strong.
You're not getting strong, right? But you'll get better, but you're not getting strong. So trying to balance that line between that kind of their philosophy and the strength and conditioning, and try to mitigate that in between road. So they're testing cervical endurance holds, which is beneficial, but it's telling one aspect of the story, right? Yeah. So now I'm introducing the idea of testing force, which we just use a hand dynamometer, which essentially like grip strength, the same kind of dynamometer that was used for that. We use to test strength, force production of the neck. We're actually, AFRL, Air Force Research Lab, just built a chair. It's kind of like a cockpit chair that will strap in these fighter pilots, and we'll be able to test their neck, which is an idea that I got from F1 Racing. That's what they're doing. Makes perfect sense. So we'll be testing force production in the neck. I have research studies that are going to come out with those kind of metrics to kind of see how much force is needed for them to produce. And then as well, we'll look at rotational aspects, right? Because it's great if you could produce force, flexion, extension, and rotational, but all of a sudden, if you can't produce enough force and you can't rotate, the probability of injury, and I'm speculating, is going to go through the roof.
Huge.
Which would be the same as jiu-jitsu or anything else.
It's funny. It's like, wow, this is like incredible. This is one of the few times I've hardly ever spoken during the podcast. So much interesting stuff to discuss. But one thing I would like to do, because I like to have you back on once you get that data on the neck, I'd like to actually dedicate a podcast just to the neck. So before we wrap up, is I know you're going to send me all your links and so forth, but is there anything that you could tell the audience they can look up about you right now, or something that'd be beneficial to them that you have, or, you know, check you out on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or what?
Yeah. So, and we just had this conversation. So
Yeah.
when I owned my business, I was very prevalent on the Instagram and Facebook
Right.
and LinkedIn. But now, because a lot of the research I do is in the military space, it draws that line. Like I can't, all the cool stuff that I do, I can't really post on
Yeah.
LinkedIn. But I could go to a seminar and share that kind of stuff, but I
Right.
can't just put it on social media. So there's not a lot of information.
Okay.
But what I can do is I'll send you all my links. Like I'm probably
Yes.
most prevalent on LinkedIn because that's how I met you.
Right.
The majority of the professionals, this is where we have like professional conversations.
Yes.
And it's good because I like to, some things that I see people doing, it's not that I'm ever challenging them, but I'm like, man, that's cool. Let me see what you got. And it's generally not and no offense to Instagram and all that jazz, but it's not I'm trying to obtain followers. Like I like LinkedIn because it eliminates a lot of the BS.
Yeah.
So yes, I'll get you my LinkedIn.
Excellent. I'll send that out to everyone. Guys, thank you for listening. Tony, you've been great. I'll catch up with you right after. Strength and honor.